So good afternoon. Welcome to this session. My name is Ben Chong. I'm a product manager on cloud storage. So my primary mission and end goal in life right now is to help you guys get your data onto GCP. Today we have a bunch of slides, so let's keep questions until the end, and I'll be around if you guys want to talk to me individually after this session. So let's start the afternoon with talking about Google's mission. I think you guys may have heard this already. So our mission is to organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. And to achieve this mission, we have built this really big, complex, advanced global architecture and infrastructure. And with Cloud Platform, we are basically making this same set of tools and infrastructure available to you, so that you can also organize your company's information and make it accessible and useful, right? With machine learning, BigQuery, and so on. Now, the key, though, in order to use all these tools that are available on Cloud Platform is that you need to get your data in, right? Your company's information needs to be brought onto GCP so they can run BigQuery. You can use the new spanner tools and so on. And we'll kind of cover that today. So let's cover two types of data sources and two types of data, right? First, let's talk about unstructured data. So unstructured data is what we call files that are on your file system in your data center, and structured data are databases, whether it's big data or MySQL databases and so on. Let's start with unstructured data first. So when we talk about unstructured data on Cloud Platform, it's basically Google Cloud Storage, right? So that's where unstructured data lives. We all know it. I hope we all love it as well. Think of it as your cloud hard drive. So like GCE may be your CPU, and cloud storage is your hard drive. We have two classes of storage, multi-regional and regional for live data. So data that changes all the time that you're using for compute workloads to serve media content to your customers or end users. And then we have two classes, nearline and coldline for colder storage. There's a kind of data that you are not planning to touch for like 30 days or 90 days, then it's worth storing into nearline or coldline. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. There are details online. There were sessions earlier this week that went into some details on how to use GCS for performance and so on. All that content will be available after the event. If you have specific questions, do reach out to your sales reps. They are there to answer your questions. The next couple of slides covers kind of like very high-level considerations, like what should you think about when you use cloud storage. So storage tiers, right? I covered the 4 storage tiers. You want to make sure that you choose the right ones for the right workloads. It's not the end of the world if you don't choose the right one. You can always move data around. The only thing you want to make sure is that if you started off with objects in nearline or coldline, you may incur what we call early deletion charges if you delete them before 30 days or 90 days. Data locality can depend on two factors to data locality is like where are your consumers, where's the consumer of the data. If the data is going to be consumed by compute is kind of like regional, right, like US Central, US East, in which case then you want to make sure that your buckets are nearby. So you want to choose regional buckets versus multi-regional buckets. And one thing that a lot of people get caught by is bucket names are kind of based on a global namespace. So your bucket name has to be pretty unique. Don't use personally identifiable information to name a bucket. And then you should create buckets, pre-create buckets if necessary, as opposed to kind of like including the bucket creation in your workflow. Additional considerations, so if you have lots of buckets, use GUID instead of kind of names. Request rates, if you are planning to do a lot of write requests, you want to scale up instead of like hitting the system all of a sudden. We do have certain similarities with S3 in the terms of if you have sequential names, you probably don't want to kind of like write the objects sequential names one after another because that will impact performance as well. So let's go into the meat, right? So how do you get data into GCS? Let's do a straw poll to understand like what kind of networks that you guys have. Who has like 1 gig networks like uplink? Okay, 10 gigs. How many of you don't know what kind of network you have? Okay. Um, so how quickly and easily you can upload data into GCS depends on the kind of network, right? So this is what we call laws of physics and speed of light. So imagine you have just a 1 gig network uplink, assuming 100% utilization, so nobody else is doing emails. If you have 1 petabyte of data, it's going to take you more than 3 months. So these are considerations. So a lot of times we don't think about network when we're thinking about moving data. So my point here is that let's think about network. Network is part of the equation of uploading data into GCS or GCP. Which brings us to the next slide. So here's how we can look at the world, right? So distance to GCP is the x-axis. So if your data is in GCS or in another cloud, it is closer to GCP. If your data is in a location with no network at all, you are kind of like really far away. And then the y-axis is the amount of data. Now, if your data is in GCS, like for example, you have data in a bucket in Europe, you want to move it to the US, so that's kind of like 0.0. If your data is in another cloud, like S3, you're not too far away, and we have a tool called transfer service for that. What is transfer service? So cloud storage transfer service is essentially a 3-step process to quickly import online data into GCS, right? So it's really good for moving data from S3 to GCS. GCS to GCS transfer, like I was saying, if you have data from one region, you can move it to another region. Or if you want to, like earlier, if you kind of selected a multi-regional bucket and you realize that, oh, maybe it's better for the data to be in a regional bucket, then you can use transfer service to do a migration. Very popular use cases, right? So we have customers who are S3 customers, and we are fine with that, right? This is kind of like, open cloud world. They back up their data to GCS, whether primary, secondary backups, and they use transfer service, right? Daily, we're talking about petabytes of data a week. A lot of customers, again, like complete workloads in S3, in AWS, they love BigQuery. So what they do, they use transfer service to move their log files and other data across to GCS, import into BigQuery. Transfer service allows you to schedule either one-time transfers or recurring transfers, and you can do hourly transfers as well. So where's transfer service? Transfer service is not a tool that you can install. It is a cloud-hosted tool. So you go to our cloud console. You can find it under the storage section, right under called transfer, obviously. When you click on transfer, you'll get a list of transfer jobs, and then if you click on the create transfer job, you can then create a transfer job. So step 1 would be you specify your source. So it could be a cloud, Google's GCS bucket, or S3 bucket, or you can actually transfer from HTTP, HTTPS sources. And then you can kind of specify conditions, right? So transfer files only with certain prefixes, or exclude files with certain prefixes. How many of you know, like, why prefixes are important in object storage? Not many. So object storage is kind of like a flat storage, right? So there's no concept of folders, like physical folders and directories. So a lot of customers, they use prefixes to kind of like identify folders. So for example, in your local file system, you may have A/B/C/object or file, right, where the slashes are kind of denote your directory limitations. So when you import that file into GCS, it will be named, for example, A/B/C/file name, right, or object name. So the directory prefixes becomes part of the file name or the object name. And so by using these prefix conditions, you can say that, okay, I'm going to transfer only certain files in certain folders or directories into GCS. Another way of defining source would be Amazon S3, right? So you define enter the name of the S3 bucket, access key ID, and the secret access key, and all those things you can get from the Amazon console. So step 2 is where you identify the destination, and you do have transfer options where you overwrite the destination if it already exists, or delete objects at the source, or you delete objects if the source object has been deleted. right? So it's kind of like a synchronization mechanism. And then finally, step 3 is where you configure the transfer, right? We can run it now, or you can run it at a later time, on a daily basis. And then when you click on create, it creates a transfer job. It gets queued up for running. Right, so that's transfer service for you. Obviously, tips. I think there's a recap of earlier. Right, you can do hourly syncs, and so you can create basically 24 transfer jobs 1 hour apart. So that gives you an hourly sync mechanism. All right, so we'll talk about transfer service. So what if your data is in a colo or in your own data center, but with good network connectivity? So for that, we have a tool called GSUtil. It's all lowercase. So GSUtil is our primary command line tool, right? It runs on Windows, Linux, Mac. It can run on a GCE instance. You could even run it on an EC2 instance if you like. It's actively maintained, actively supported. Unix-friendly syntax, lots of documentation. There's also a Stack Overflow discussion. So performance, GSUtil can run multi-threaded, so you can have multiple processes that will upload data in parallel. If you have lots of large data files, you can GSUtil can break up the data files into chunks to upload the chunks in parallel. And then once uploaded, it will reconstitute the original file and delete the chunks. So that's where there's a caution there, right? If you are uploading, using this feature to upload to nearline or coline, when you delete the chunks, you do incur what we call early deletion penalty. So download has the same benefits. So retry. So we do have retry logic for transient network failures. There are more details here. I'm not going to go into each and every line. And then there's something called a manifest file. So we can generate a manifest file automatically when we run. And the manifest file will indicate, you can see the example there of which objects or files were successfully transferred, and then failures as well. And the manifest file itself can be used as an input into GSUtil, so you can do an auto retry of failures. So a lot of customers use it that way. In a lot of cases, because we are kind of running HTTP requests, sometimes there are failures, right? So for whatever reason, a file is not uploaded. So you can use the manifest file as an input to make sure that if you have 1 million files, that all of them are actually uploaded effectively. There's also resumability. So there's automatic for large objects. And then there's this the resume file that we use to track uploads in process. So if that's blocked or for whatever reason, we can do a resume using this data. So tips and tricks. I think the key one is the first bullet point, right? So if you have lots of data, right, a huge data set, you want to partition that data set and use multiple hosts for transfers. Multiple hosts means like physical machines or VMs, and each one will run its own instance of GSUtil, uploading a section of your data source. What this does is that then you effectively has a whole bunch of GSUtil instances and threads uploading the data at the same time, kind of saturating your network as much as possible. We don't have any network throttling, so you have to kind of use other tricks like trickle or enforce the bandwidth utilization at the network layer. If you are concerned about POSIX metadata at all, there's a -P option that was recently introduced to capture the POSIX attributes of your source files and store that as a GCS metadata as part of the object that's in GCS. All right, so GSUtil itself is a relatively basic tool. We don't do kind of like network optimization. So if you want even better transfer speeds, we have partners, Tavella, with Cloud FastPath, Aspera or BitsBit. So some of them, they do UDP or TCP optimization, right, for better speeds. All right, so what if your data sources are at locations, right, with low bandwidth or no bandwidth at all? So the solution there is offline data transfer or offline import-export. Well, import in this case. So what this means is that you have a physical storage media, whether hard drives or storage appliance. You load the data in there, ship the hardware to an ingestion point with good network, and someone there will ingest the data to GCS for you. We have several third-party providers to do this. We launched this collaboration about a year and a half ago. So in North America, we have Iron Mountain. You can see the pricing here. In EMEA and APAC, we have Prime Focus Technologies. So we have a bunch of customers using these services. Customers essentially sign up with these third-party service providers, like separately from Google. Now, a lot of use cases are where data is generated offline, for example, at sea, collected on hard drives. So when the ship reaches port, what they do is that they ship the hard drives to Iron Mountain, get the data ingested. It's not necessarily a lot of data, right? Sometimes we are talking about gigabytes or hundreds of gigabytes of data. But when you're out at sea, you can't, generally you cannot even send 1 byte, right, if you don't have network. So they kind of use this offline method. Now, what's new here is that we just started working with Zadara to offer live offline migration of live data. They have a booth downstairs if you guys want to talk to them about this. So how this works is that they will send you like 2 appliances. You capture the data onto the appliances. You ship one to Zadara. They will upload to GCS. And then they will use the second appliance to do synchronization of data that has changed. Right? So if you think about like the hard drive approach, basically you're taking a snapshot loading of your data, loading into the hard drive, shipping it out. But what if your data evolves, right? So Zadara kind of solves that problem. And because they're using storage appliances, you could capture a lot more data than on an individual like 10 terabyte hard drive. So it's a summary. So we have transfer service, right, for cloud data, GSUtil and partner products for data in locations with good network. If you don't have a lot of data, right, say under 100 terabytes or so, you can use like hard drive imports, right? Because if you have more data, then the number of hard drives become kind of unmanageable. If you have more data or live data, then there's Zadara for you, right? So let's cover structured data. Now, structured data is more a partner play. So we have a number of partners who can help you migrate data from on-premise databases or even other cloud databases to Cloud SQL and Spanner. So we have Informatica. Xplenty supports both flavors of Cloud SQL, right? MySQL and Postgres. Segment, Stitch, Talent, and Illuma support Postgres, SQL, and DBVisit at Unity supports MySQL only. Similarly, if you're interested in importing data into Dataproc, we have a whole bunch of partners for that. And depending on where you want to land the data, whether on GCS or persistent disk, we have different partners supporting the different targets. So finally, a BigQuery data integration partner. So again, partner play, right, generally. Everything from what we call SaaS data sources. So those are marketing CRM data sources, databases like MySQL, SQL Server, Postgres, Oracle, or data warehouses like Teradata, Vertica, and Netezza. Now, BigQuery is becoming very popular with marketeers, right? So you can use BigQuery to analyze the like click rates and all that to kind of figure out like whether your advertising campaign is effective. So we just announced BigQuery data transfer service. And that basically allows you to import data from Google ad platforms into BigQuery for analysis. Now, we also support other sources, right, of marketing data, so whether Adobe Analytics, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, through our partner ecosystem. So you can check out the link here. This is basically pretty updated to kind of like give you an idea of which partners are available to do this data import. And then reach out to your rep as well if you have like additional needs. So we have covered unstructured data and structured data. Let's talk about IT workflow perspective. This is actually a summary of the talk I had yesterday, just about 3-4 slides. So IT workflows are generally things like bursting, caching, backup, disaster recovery, tiering and archiving, right? How can IT, IT staff running these standard workflows, how can they get data onto the cloud? So cloud bursting, what's that, right? So cloud bursting is essentially you are running workloads on premise on your own data in your own data centers, and you want to take advantage of what we can offer in the cloud, right? For compute, for example, like low cost, scale, even failover, and then you care about like making sure that the data that's on premise is available to the compute workloads in the cloud, and then you don't want the big hassle of like explicitly like moving data around. We partner with Avia, for example. They're really great for compute, high performance compute, because they allow you to store data that's on premise, make the data available for compute instances in the cloud, or vice versa, which is you have data in the cloud, right, taking advantage of low-cost GCS, and then allowing on-premise compute to access the data that's in the cloud. So to talk about backup, so if you have existing backup solutions, you can very, very easily retarget, right, your backup destination to the cloud. So we work with partners like Veritas and so on, and it's just a UI change. You can see the example here on the right. And then if you don't have existing backup solutions, we are working with a lot of partners that support us today, so you can talk to them. If you don't have existing backup solutions, but then your workflow or data set is very simple, then you can use like cloud gateway solutions. Again, we have a lot of partners that will support you on that. Cloud tiering is interesting, right? So there are two ways of looking at cloud tiering. Generally one way of looking at cloud tiering, which is you have data, like on-premise storage where you hold all of your data. Now, the problem with on-premise storage is that it's really expensive. So why not move some of that data to cloud, right? To take advantage of our scale and low cost, especially like Coline, for example. And so you can kind of like make space for additional kind of like live data on-premise. So we have a partner called Comprise that can do an analysis of your data usage on-premise, and they can identify which data is kind of like cold data, and they can help you move the data across to the cloud based on policy and so on. Another way of doing it is, if you are onboarding new storage devices or storage technologies, you can go with on-premise object storage vendors like Cloudin here. And they do automatic tiering, right? So kind of making sure that the colder data automatically gets tiered to GCS. So a summary here is that, for whatever kind of IT workflows that you have, and if you want to kind of like leverage a cloud or even explore moving some of the data to the cloud, we have a whole ecosystem of partners for that. Okay, so wrap up. If there's one thing to remember is this slide, right? So we have different data sources, different generation, and what are the destinations and what are the solutions. Okay, so everything from S3 to IT workflows, cloud storage, databases, Cloud SQL, for example, and partner solutions, transfer service, and so on. So if you're planning to ingest data into GCP, reach out to your sales rep, right? There's a lot of things that we are doing that we can't talk about publicly. So your sales rep may be able to kind of like talk to you more under NDA about other stuff that we are doing. As a PM responsible for ingestion, I want to make sure that you guys are successful moving your data into cloud. So where you have, again, like data ingestion projects and so on, reach out to your sales rep, they'll get back to me, and then we can potentially work together. All right, thanks.